The sky erupted in a symphony of death. I pressed my face against the cold steel of the gun director as another Zero screamed past our starboard bow, its engine howling like a banshee from hell. The pilot's eyes met mine for one terrible instant, young, determined, already dead. Then the 5-inch guns roared again, and the Kamikaze disappeared in a brilliant orange fireball that painted the dawn sky crimson. My name is James Mickey Morrison, and I was a fire control operator aboard the destroyer USS Lafey on April 16, 1945, off the coast of Okinawa. What I witnessed that morning would haunt my dreams for decades to come. It was the day we faced the divine wind, the Kamikaze, and somehow Levetto tell about it. But let me start at the beginning, because every sailor's story begins with the sea. The Pacific stretched endlessly before us, a deceptive blue mirror that reflected the early morning sun like scattered diamonds. It was beautiful and terrible, the same ocean that had swallowed so many good men over the past 3 years of war. I stood at my battle station in the gun director, high above the Laffey's deck, watching the horizon through my optical rangefinder. The air tasted of salt spray and diesel fuel, with that metallic tang that always came before a fight. "Mickey, you getting anything on that scope?" Killed out Seaman First Class Tommy Chin from his position at the radar console. Tommy was from San Francisco, barely 19, with quick hands and sharper eyes. He'd been tracking bogies all morning, Japanese aircraft probing our defenses around the fleet. "Negative contact," I replied, adjusting the focus on my director telescope. "But they're out there. I can feel it." The USS Laffey was a Sumner-class destroyer, 376 feet of American steel bristling with firepower. We carried 6 5-inch guns, 12 40mm Bofors cannons, and 11 20mm Oerlikon guns. On paper, we were a formidable opponent. But paper didn't account for the terror that came with facing men who had already chosen to die. Captain Frederick Julian Becton stood on the bridge below us, his weathered face scanning the horizon. At 36, he was ancient by Navy standards, old enough to have wisdom, young enough to have reflexes. The crew called him Iron Mike behind his back, not out of disrespect, but because he was harder than the steel hull beneath our feet. "All stations, this is the captain." Becton's voice crackled through the ship's communication system. "Intelligence reports heavy enemy air activity inbound. We're on radar picket duty, gentlemen. That means we're the early warning system for the fleet, and we're going to be the first ones they hit. Check your equipment, check your ammo, and remember your training. We've got a job to do." Radar picket duty. The most dangerous assignment in the Pacific. We were positioned 60 miles northwest of Okinawa, alone except for 2 landing craft and a handful of fighter planes, serving as the eyes and ears for the massive invasion fleet behind us. When the Japanese came, and they would come, we'd be their first target. I ran my hands over the controls of the Mark 37 gun director, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility. This wasn't just machinery. It was the brain of our defensive system. Every calculation I made, every range estimate, every bearing I called out would determine whether our guns hit their targets or whether those targets hit us. "Contact. Contact." Tommy's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. "Multiple bogies, bearing 270, range 40 miles, and closing fast." The alarm klaxon began its mournful wail, and suddenly the peaceful morning exploded into controlled chaos. Sailors ran to their battle stations, the sound of their boots echoing against the steel deck like machine gun fire. The 5-inch guns traversed toward the threat, their barrels rising like the fingers of some enormous metal hand. "This is it, boys," I whispered to myself, pressing my eye to the rangefinder. "Here comes the divine wind." The enemy came like a plague of locusts. I counted 22 aircraft in the first wave, Zeros, Vals, and Kates, their rising sun emblems clearly visible against the blue sky. They weren't flying in any formation I recognized. This wasn't a coordinated attack. This was a swarm of individual death sentences, each pilot committed to taking one of us with him. Range to 8,000, I called out, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Bearing 272, multiple targets. The first salvo from our 5-inch guns shattered the morning calm. The sound was indescribable, a thunderclap that seemed to tear the very air apart. I watched the black puffs of flak burst around the incoming aircraft, some close enough to rock the planes in their deadly flight paths. Got one, shouted gunner's mate First Class Bill Sanders from the number 2 mount. A Zero had taken a direct hit and was spinning toward the ocean, trailing black smoke and orange flames. But for every one we hit, 3 more kept coming. The 40mm guns joined the chorus, their rapid bark adding a staccato rhythm to the deep bass of the 5-inch batteries. Then came the 20mm, chattering like angry typewriters as the enemy closed to point-blank range. Mary and Joseph, muttered Quartermaster Second Class Patrick O'Brien, crossing himself as he watched a Kate bomber dive straight at our bow. The pilot's face was visible in the cockpit, his white headband streaming in the wind. He was maybe 20 years old, younger than my kid brother back in Iowa. Our number 1 gun swiveled to track the Kate, the barrel depressing to minimum elevation. The range was so close I could see the rivets on the bomber's wings. Fire! 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 I screamed into the communication system. The 5-inch shell caught the Kate center mass, and the aircraft simply vaporized. One moment it was there, 1,000 pounds of metal and explosives and human determination. The next it was nothing but expanding gases and falling debris. The explosion was so close it rattled our teeth and sent fragments pinging off the gun director's armor. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Zero was coming in from the starboard quarter, its engine screaming as the pilot pushed it to maximum power. This one was different, older, more experienced. He weaved between our tracers like a man dancing with death, and death was winning. Can't get a lock on him, Tommy shouted, his hands flying over the radar controls. He's too low, too fast. The Zero leveled out 50 feet above the water, aimed straight at our engine room. If he hit there, if he took out our power plant, we'd be a sitting duck for the rest of the attack. I could see the pilot's face now, calm and determined, already committed to his final act. Then Lieutenant Commander Bill Youngquist, our gunnery officer, did something I'll never forget. He grabbed the manual controls for the after 40mm mount and began tracking the Zero by hand, ignoring the streams of machine gun bullets that were chewing up the deck around him. Come on, you son of a, he muttered, his jaw set in concentration. Come to Papa. The Zero was 200 yards out when Youngquist opened fire. The 40mm shells walked across the water like deadly stepping stones, each one getting closer to the target. At 100 yards, they found their mark. The Zero's engine exploded in a gout of flame and smoke. The aircraft cartwheeled into the sea, sending up a geyser of water that soaked the men on the fantail. But even as it died, the plane's momentum carried it forward, and pieces of wreckage scattered across our deck. Damage report. Captain Beckton's voice boomed over the intercom. Minor damage to the after deck, sir, came the reply. No casualties. But the first wave wasn't over. 3 more aircraft were boring in from different directions, and I could see the second wave forming up on the horizon. My mouth was dry as desert sand, and my hands were shaking from the adrenaline, but I kept my eye pressed to the rangefinder. Mickey. Tommy grabbed my shoulder. Look at 12 o'clock high. I swiveled the director upward and felt my blood turn to ice. A Val dive bomber was coming straight down at us, its dive brakes deployed, the pilot aiming for the bridge. If he hit there, he'd take out the command structure of the ship. All guns, I shouted. Dive bomber, dead ahead. Elevate, elevate. Every gun that could bear open fire at once. The sky filled with tracers, creating a cone of death that the Val had to fly through. But the pilot never wavered. He kept his dive angle perfect, his aim true, even as our shells burst all around him. 50 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. Then Seaman First Class Joe Franklin, manning one of the 20-millimeter guns, walked a burst right through the Val's cockpit. The pilot slumped forward, and the aircraft's nose dropped. Instead of hitting the bridge, it slammed into the water just off our port bow, sending a column of water high into the air. "We got him," Franklin shouted, his face blackened with powder burns, but grinning like a madman. "We got but his celebration was short-lived. The second wave was already upon us. What happened next defied every tactical manual ever written. The Japanese didn't attack in coordinated waves or follow any conventional strategy. They came at us from every direction at once, high, low, from the sun, from the clouds, some diving vertically, others skimming the waves. It was chaos given wings and murderous intent. I lost count of the targets. My world narrowed to the rangefinder scope, the sound of my own voice calling out ranges and bearings, and the continuous thunder of our guns. The air was so thick with smoke and cordite that I could barely breathe. "Bogey at 2 o'clock low," I called out, tracking a Zero that was trying to sneak in under our radar coverage. "Range 1500 and closing." The number 3 gun swiveled to meet the threat, but the Zero pilot was crafty. He waited until the last second, then pulled up into a climbing turn that took him behind our superstructure, using our own ship as cover. "I've lost him," shouted Fire Controlman Second Class Danny Martinez from the aft director. "He's in our blind spot." The Zero reappeared on our port side, diving at a 45-degree angle toward the ammunition handling room. If he hit there, the explosion would break our back. But our port side 20-millimeter guns were ready. Seaman First Class Robert Johnson and Seaman Second Class Willie Washington worked their guns like men possessed, their tracers converging on the diving Zero. The aircraft flew straight into their crossfire and disintegrated, raining metal fragments across the deck. "That's how we do it in Detroit," Johnson shouted, his gun smoking from the heat of continuous firing. But there was no time for congratulations. A Kate bomber was coming in from the starboard beam, so low its propeller was kicking up spray from the wave tops. This pilot was good. He knew that flying at sea level would make him almost invisible to our radar until the last second. "Starboard lookouts," I yelled. Kate bomber, 4 o'clock, on the deck. Gunner's mate Third Class Anthony Zaloga, manning the starboard 40-millimeter mount, swung his gun toward the target. The Kate was maybe 500 yards out, its torpedo visible beneath the fuselage like a steel shark. "He's making a torpedo run," Zaloga shouted. Turning to port, the Kate banged into its attack run, and I could see the pilot's face behind the windscreen, his expression focused and determined. He was lining up for the perfect shot, aiming for our engine room. Then something beautiful happened. 4 F-4U Corsairs from the Combat Air Patrol dove out of the sun like avenging angels, their wings sparkling with machine gun fire. Beckett never saw them coming. The lead Corsair's 650 caliber machine guns tore the bomber apart, sending it cartwheeling into the sea in a shower of flames and debris. "Good shooting, flyboys," someone shouted from the deck. But the Corsairs brought their own problems. One of them, damaged by return fire from the Kate's rear gunner, was trailing smoke and losing altitude. The pilot was trying to make it back to the carrier, but he was losing power fast. "Mayday, mayday," came the voice over the radio. "This is Corsair Blue 7. I'm hid and going down. Repeat, I'm going down." I watched through the rangefinder as the Corsair pilot fought to keep his aircraft airborne. He was maybe 25, with the kind of mustache that made all the Navy pilots look like movie stars. But movie stars don't usually die at sea, alone and far from home. The Corsair hit the water about 2 miles off our starboard bow, sending up a huge splash. For a moment, I thought the pilot was done for, but then I saw him climb out of the cockpit onto the wing of his sinking aircraft. "Man overboard," I shouted into the intercom. Down pilot, bearing 090, range 2 miles. But we couldn't break formation to rescue him. Not with more Japanese aircraft inbound. The pilot would have to wait for the rescue destroyers if he could stay afloat that long. Meanwhile, the attack continued with undiminished fury. A Zero came in from dead ahead, its cannons firing, the 20mm shells walking across our deck like deadly hail. Sailors dove for cover behind gun mounts and superstructure, but there was nowhere to run on a ship at sea. Seaman First Class Frank Zenkovich, manning the forward 20mm gun, never flinched. He kept his gun trained on the Zero, firing burst after burst even as the Japanese pilot's bullets chewed up the deck around him. At the last second, his tracers found their mark, and the Zero's engine caught fire. But the pilot didn't pull up. He kept coming, aiming his burning aircraft directly at our bridge. It was a deliberate ramming attack, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. "Brace for impact," Captain Becton's voice boomed over the intercom. "All hands, brace for impact." The Zero hit us amidships, just below the bridge. The explosion was tremendous, a sheet of flame that reached up to the sky and sent debris flying in all directions. The ship shuddered like a living thing in pain, and for a moment I thought we were going to break apart. When the smoke cleared, I saw the damage. The Zero had punched a hole in our port side, and fires were burning in 3 different compartments. But we were still afloat, still fighting. "Damage control parties, lay to the port side," came the call. "We've got fires in the forward mess hall and the radio room." But the Japanese weren't finished with us. Not by a long shot. The third wave arrived like a vision from hell. I counted 18 aircraft, all of them diving at once from different altitudes and angles. It was a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm our defenses through sheer numbers. They were willing to sacrifice every pilot to take us with them, whispered Tommy Chen, his face pale as he watched the radar scope. "There's too many of them, Mickey. Too many." But Captain Becton's voice cut through the despair like a sword through silk. "All hands, this is the captain. We've been hurt, but we're not out of this fight. Every gun that can bear, engage at will. Make every shot count, and remember, we're Americans, and Americans don't give up." His words were like electricity through the ship. I felt it in my bones, in my blood. We were Americans, and we had a job to do. The first Zero in the new wave came in from the port quarter, its engine screaming as the pilot pushed it to maximum power. This one was different. The aircraft was painted in green and brown camouflage, and I could see the pilot's white headband streaming in the wind. He was one of the experienced ones, the veterans who had volunteered for this final mission. "Port quarter, low and fast," I called out, adjusting the director to track the target. "Range 1200 in closing." The after 5-inch gun swiveled to meet the threat, but the Zero pilot was crafty. He waited until the gun was almost on target, then snap rolled to the right, using his aircraft's superior maneuverability to throw off our aim. The 5-inch shell passed harmlessly through the space where the Zero had been a split second before. But gunner's mate second class Michael Kowalski was ready with the 40mm mount. His burst caught the Zero in the wing root, and the aircraft began to smoke. But the pilot didn't break off. He kept coming, aiming for our after stack. If he hit there, he'd take out our radar and communications equipment, leaving us blind and deaf. "He's not pulling out," Kowalski shouted. "He's coming right at us." The Zero was 50 yards away when Seaman First Class James Butler, manning the after 20mm gun, opened fire with everything he had. His tracers walked right up the Zero's fuselage, and the aircraft exploded in a ball of fire just 30 feet above our deck. The explosion was so close it knocked several men off their feet and sent fragments raining down on the superstructure. But we were still in the fight. Meanwhile, 2 more Zeros were approaching from the starboard side, flying in a loose formation. These pilots were working together, trying to split our defensive fire. One would attract our attention while the other snuck in for the kill. Multiple bogeys, starboard beam, I shouted. They're working together. The starboard 40mm guns engaged the lead zero, sending a stream of shells toward the aircraft. But the pilot was experienced. He jinked left and right, up and down, making himself a difficult target while his wingman circled wide to the right. Then I saw what they were doing. The lead zero was the decoy, drawing our fire while the wingman set up for a diving attack from the sun. It was a classic fighter tactic, adapted for a suicide mission. "Danny," I called to Martinezin, the aft director. "There's another one at 4 o'clock high. He's using the sun for cover." Martin swiveled his director upward, squinting against the glare. "I see him. Val dive bomber, starting his run." The Val was coming down at a 70-degree angle, its dive brakes deployed, the pilot aiming for our engine room. If he hit there, we'd lose power and become a sitting duck for the rest of the attack. Every gun that could elevate opened fire at once. The sky filled with black puffs of flak, and tracers created a cone of death that the Val had to fly through. But the pilot never wavered. He kept his dive angle perfect, his aim true, even as our shells burst all around him. Then something incredible happened. Seaman First Class John Delevsky, manning the number 4 20mm gun, made a shot that belonged in the history books. As the Val pulled out of its dive, Delevsky led the target perfectly and put a burst right through the cockpit. The pilot slumped forward, and the aircraft's nose dropped. Instead of hitting our engine room, the Val slammed into the water just off our starboard bow, sending up a geyser that soaked the forward gun crews. The explosion was so close it cracked windows in the pilot house, but we were still afloat. "Outstanding shooting, Delevsky." Captain Becton's voice boomed over the intercom. "Outstanding." But the attack was far from over. The decoy zero had broken off its evasive maneuvers and was now diving straight at us, its cannons firing. 20mm shells walked across our deck, punching holes in everything they touched. Seaman Second Class Robert Dockery, manning the forward 20mm gun, never flinched. He kept his weapon trained on the zero, firing burst after burst even as the Japanese pilot's bullets chewed up the deck around him. At the last second, Dockery's tracers found their mark. The Zero's engine exploded in a sheet of flame, and the aircraft cartwheeled into the sea just 50 yards off our port bow. "Got him," Dockery shouted, his face blackened with powder burns, but grinning like a man who had just cheated death. But death wasn't finished with us yet. A Cape bomber was approaching from the port quarter, flying so low its propeller was kicking up spray from the wave tops. This pilot was skilled. He knew that flying at sea level would make him almost invisible to our radar until the last second. "Cape bomber, port quarter on the deck," I called out, swinging the director to track the target. "Range 800 and closing fast." The port side guns swiveled to meet threat, but the Kate was already in its attack run. The pilot pulled up slightly, revealing the torpedo slung beneath his aircraft like a steel coffin. "Torpedo in the water," came the shout from the lookouts. Torpedo running hot and straight. The Kate had dropped its fish at the perfect range and angle. The torpedo was aimed directly at our engine room, and there was nothing we could do to avoid it. The destroyer can't turn fast enough to dodge a torpedo at close range. But sometimes, in war, luck is more important than skill. The torpedo passed directly under our keel, running too deep to trigger its contact detonator. We felt the vibration as it passed beneath us, but there was no explosion. "Torpedo missed," shouted the lookout. Torpedo ran under us. The Kate pilot, having expended his weapon, could have turned away and tried to escape. But he didn't. Instead, he pulled up into a climbing turn and came back at us, aiming his aircraft at our bridge like a manned missile. "He's coming back," I shouted. All guns, all guns." He's making a ramming attack. Every weapon on the ship opened fire at once. The Kate flew through a storm of steel and explosive shells, But the pilot never wavered. He was committed to his final attack, and nothing was going to stop him except death itself. At the last second, just as the Kate was about to hit us, a burst from the numbered 240mm gun caught the aircraft in the engine. The Kate exploded in a ball of fire and crashed into the sea just 20 yards off our starboard bow. The explosion was so close it shattered windows and sent debris flying across the deck. But we were still afloat, still fighting. Damage report. Captain Beckton called out. Minor damage to the superstructure, sir, came the reply. No casualties. But the battle was far from over. The fourth wave was already forming up on the horizon, and I could see more aircraft approaching from the north. The Japanese were throwing everything they had at us, and we were running low on ammunition. Mickey, Tommy Chin called out, his voice tight with exhaustion. How much longer can we keep this up? I looked at my watch. We had been under attack for 3 hours, and it felt like 3 years. My hands were shaking from fatigue, my throat was raw from shouting commands, and my ears were ringing from the continuous thunder of our guns. As long as it takes, I replied, pressing my eye back to the rangefinder. As long as it takes. The fourth wave came at us like something out of a nightmare. 24 aircraft, all diving at once from different directions. They had learned from the previous attacks, and now they were coming in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm our defenses through sheer numbers. All stations, all stations. Captain Beckton's voice crackled over the intercom. This is the big one, boys. Make every shot count. I could see the determination in their faces, pilots who had written their own death sentences and were now delivering them by hand. These weren't the green recruits we had faced in the early waves. These were the veterans, the skilled pilots who had volunteered for this final mission. The first Zero came in from the starboard quarter, its engine screaming as the pilot pushed it to maximum power. This one was different. The aircraft was painted in a distinctive green and yellow camouflage, and I could see the pilot's white headbands streaming in the wind. Starboard quarter, high and fast, I called out, tracking the target through the rangefinder. Range 2000 and closing. The starboard 5-inch gun swiveled to meet the threat, but the Zero pilot was experienced. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a split-S maneuver, using gravity to increase his speed while throwing off our tracking solution. The 5-inch shell exploded where the Zero had been a second before, but the aircraft was already diving toward us from a new angle. The pilot had used a classic fighter maneuver to defeat our fire control system. He's good, muttered Fire Controlman First Class Steve Vasilevsky, adjusting his tracking controls. This one's really good. But our gunners were learning too. Gunners Mate Second Class Arthur Lundgren, manning the number 340mm mount, didn't try to track the Zero's evasive maneuvers. Instead, he aimed where the aircraft would be when it leveled out for its final attack run. The Zero pilot pulled out of his dive at exactly the wrong moment. Lundgren's burst caught the aircraft's center mass, and it exploded in a ball of fire and debris. The pilot never had a chance to scream. Got him. Lundgren shouted, his face streaked with sweat and cordite. Got the but 2 more Zeros were already boring in from the port side, flying in a tight formation. These pilots were working together, trying to split our defensive fire. It was a sound tactic, and it almost worked. Multiple bogeys, port beam, I shouted. They're working together. The port side guns engaged the lead Zero, sending a stream of tracers toward the aircraft. But the pilots were experienced. They separated at the last second, forcing our gunners to choose between targets. Seaman First Class William Meredith, manning the port 20mm gun, made his choice. He stayed with the lead Zero, walking his tracers up the aircraft's fuselage. The plane began to smoke, then caught fire, then exploded in a sheet of flame. But the wingman was still coming. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a vertical dive, aiming directly at our number 2 gun mount. If he hit there, he'd take out one of our primary weapons and several good men. Dive bomber, 12 o'clock high. I called out, swiveling the director to track the target. He's going for number 2 gun. The after guns couldn't elevate enough to engage the target, and the forward guns were masked by our own superstructure. For a moment, it looked like the Zero would get through. Then Seaman Second Class-Year-Old Sampson did something that took my breath away. He left his battle station at the 20mm gun and ran forward, directly into the Zero's line of fire. As the aircraft dove toward the ship, Sampson aimed his gun straight up and opened fire. The Zero was 50 feet above us when Sampson's tracers found their mark. The aircraft's engine exploded, and the plane cartwheeled into the sea just 20 yards off our port bow. But Sampson paid the price for his heroism. Fragments from the explosion caught him in the chest, and he crumpled to the deck. "Corpsman!" I shouted. "Corpsman to the forward deck." But Hospital Corpsman Second Class James Smith was already there, kneeling beside Sampson with his medical bag. The sailor was badly wounded, but he was still alive. "Am I going to make it, Doc?" Sampson asked, his voice weak but steady. "You're going to be fine," Smith replied, working to stop the bleeding. "Just fine." "You did good, sailor. Real good." But the attack continued without pause. A Kate bomber was approaching from the starboard beam, flying so low its propeller was kicking up spray from the wave tops. This pilot was skilled. He knew that flying at sea level would make him almost invisible to our radar until the last second. "Kate bomber, starboard beam, on the deck." I called out, tracking the target through the rangefinder. "Range 1000 and closing fast." The starboard gun swiveled to meet the threat, but the Kate was already in its attack run. The pilot pulled up slightly, and I could see the torpedo slung beneath his aircraft like a steel shark. "Torpedo in the water," came the shout from the lookouts. Torpedo running hot, straight, and normal. This one was different from the previous torpedo attack. The Kate pilot had dropped his fish at the perfect range and angle, and the torpedo was running at the correct depth. It was aimed directly at our engine room, and we couldn't avoid it. "All engines back, emergency full," Captain Becton ordered. Hard left rudder. The ship began to turn, but slowly, too slowly. A destroyer at full power needs time to change course, and we didn't have time. The torpedo was closing fast, its wake visible in the water like a line of death. Then something miraculous happened. The torpedo struck a piece of debris from one of the crashed aircraft, a chunk of wing panel that had been floating just beneath the surface. The explosion was tremendous, sending up a geyser of water that soaked everyone on deck, but it was 50 yards away from us instead of against our hull. "Torpedo exploded prematurely," shouted the lookout. "We're clear." But the Kate pilot wasn't finished. Having expended his weapon, he could have turned away and tried to escape. Instead, he pulled up into a climbing turn and came back at us, aiming his aircraft at our bridge like a manned missile. "He's coming back," I shouted. "All guns, all guns." "He's making a ramming attack." Every weapon on the ship that could bear opened fire at once. The Kate flew through a storm of steel and explosive shells, but the pilot never wavered. He was committed to his final attack, and nothing was going to stop him except death itself. The aircraft was 30 yards away when Seaman First Class George Pullen, manning the forward 40mm gun, made the shot of his life. His burst caught the Kate in the cockpit, and the pilot slumped forward over the controls. The Kate veered to the right and crashed into the sea just off our starboard bow. The explosion was so close it cracked windows in the pilot house and sent debris flying across the deck, but we were still afloat. "Outstanding shooting, Pullen." Captain Becton's voice boomed over the intercom. "Outstanding." But the battle was far from over. More aircraft were approaching from multiple directions, and I could see the fifth wave forming up on the horizon. We had been under attack for 4 hours, and our ammunition was running dangerously low. "Mickey," Tommy Chen called out, his voice hoarse from shouting target information. "I'm picking up a really big formation to the north. Looks like 20+ aircraft, all heading this way. I looked at my watch. 13:30 hours. We had been fighting for our lives since dawn, and the Japanese showed no signs of letting up. My hands were shaking from exhaustion. My throat was raw from breathing cordite smoke, and my ears were ringing from the continuous thunder of our guns. But we were still afloat, still fighting, still American. "How much ammunition do we have left?" I asked Tommy. "Not enough," he replied grimly. "Not nearly enough." The fifth wave was the largest yet, 32 aircraft combing at us from every direction. I could see them through the rangefinder, a swarm of death with wings. Each pilot committed to taking us with him into the next world. All stations, Captain Becton's voice rang out over the intercom. "We're running low on ammunition, but we're not out of this fight. Every shot has to count now. Make them pay for every inch." I could feel the weight of exhaustion in my bones. We had been at battle stations for 5 hours, and it felt like 5 years. My hands were shaking from fatigue, my vision was blurred from staring through the rangefinder, and my throat was raw from shouting commands. But we were still alive, still fighting, still American. The first aircraft in the new wave was a Val dive bomber, coming down at us from 12,000 feet. The pilot had climbed high to build up speed for his final dive, and he was coming down like a meteor. "Dive bomber, 12 o'clock high," I called out, tracking the target. "Range 6,000 and closing fast." The forward 5-inch guns elevated to maximum angle, but the Val was already committed to its dive. The pilot had his aircraft pointed straight at our bridge, and there was nothing we could do to avoid him except shoot him down. "Fire! Fire! Fire!" I shouted. The 5-inch guns roared, sending their shells arcing up toward the diving Val. The first salvo missed, the shells exploding harmlessly in the sky. The second salvo was closer, bracketing the aircraft with black puffs of smoke. The third salvo was perfect. The shell exploded right next to the Val's cockpit, and the aircraft disintegrated in a ball of fire and debris. The pilot never had a chance to scream. "Got him," shouted gunner's mate First Class Charlie Rodriguez. Right in the 10 ring. But 2 more Vals were already starting their dives, coming down from different angles. These pilots had learned from watching their comrades die. They were varying their attack patterns, making themselves harder to track. "Multiple dive bombers," I called out. One at 11 o'clock, one at 2 o'clock. The guns split their fire, trying to engage both targets simultaneously. It was a desperate gamble, but we didn't have enough ammunition to waste on extended tracking. The Val at 11 o'clock caught a 40mm burst in the engine and began to smoke. The pilot tried to hold his dive, but the aircraft was losing power. At the last second, he pulled up, trying to crash into our superstructure, but the damaged engine couldn't maintain altitude. The Val stalled 50 feet above her deck and crashed into the sea. The second Val was still coming. This pilot was skilled. He varied his dive angle, making small corrections that threw off our tracking solutions. Our shells exploded all around him, but he flew through the flak like a man possessed. "Can't get a lock," shouted Fire Controlman Second Class Pete Kowalski. "He's jinxing too much." The Val was 300 feet above us when Seaman First Class Robert Lee, manning the after 20mm gun, decided to take matters into his own hands. Instead of trying to track the aircraft's movements, he aimed at the point where the Val would have to level out for its final attack run. The dive bomber pulled out of its dive at exactly the wrong moment. Lee's burst caught the aircraft in the cockpit, and the pilot slumped forward over the controls. The Val veered to the left and crashed into the sea just 30 yards off our port bow. "Beautiful shooting, Lee," Captain Becton's voice boomed over the intercom. "Beautiful." But the attack continued without pause. 3 Zeros were approaching from the starboard quarter, flying in a tight V formation. These pilots were working together, trying to overwhelm our defenses through coordinated attacks. "Multiple bogeys, starboard quarter," I called out, swinging the director to track the lead aircraft. They're in formation. The starboard guns engaged the lead Zero, sending a stream of tracers toward the aircraft. But at the last second, the formation broke apart, with each pilot diving toward a different part of the ship. "They're splitting up," Tommy Chin shouted. "One's going for the bridge, one for the engine room, one for the after guns." It was a classic divide and conquer tactic, and it almost worked. Our gunners had to choose their targets quickly, with no time for careful tracking solutions. Gunners mate Second Class Frank Manson, manning the number 4 40mm mount, chose the Zero diving on the bridge. His burst caught the aircraft in the wing root, and the Zero began to smoke. But the pilot didn't pull out. He kept his dive angle, aiming directly at Captain Becton's position. "Bridge, look out," I shouted into the intercom. "He's coming right at you." The Zero was 50 feet above the bridge when its damaged wing gave way. The aircraft rolled inverted and crashed into the sea just off our starboard bow, sending up a geyser of water that soaked the forward gun crews. Meanwhile, Seaman First Class Tony Giorgino was engaging the Zero diving on the engine room. His 20mm tracers walked up the aircraft's fuselage, and the Zero caught fire. But the pilot was determined. He kept coming, even as flames consumed his cockpit. "He's on fire, but he's still coming," Giorgino shouted. The Zero was 20 feet above our deck when it finally disintegrated. The explosion was so close it knocked several men off their feet and sent burning debris across the superstructure. But we were still afloat. The third Zero was diving on the after gun mount, where Seaman Second Class Eddie Kowalski was manning the 20mm gun. This pilot was the most skilled of the three. He varied his dive angle, making small corrections that threw off the tracking solution. "Can't get a lock," Kowalski shouted. "He's too good." The Zero was 100 feet above us when something incredible happened. Seaman First Class John Delevsky, who had been wounded in an earlier attack, dragged himself to an unmanned 40mm gun and opened fire. Delevsky's burst caught the Zero in the engine, and the aircraft exploded in a ball of fire and debris. The pilot never had a chance to complete his attack. "Delevsky," I shouted. "You magnificent," but the sailor couldn't hear me. He had collapsed beside his gun, his strength finally giving out. Hospital Corpsman Second Class James Smith was already running toward him, medical bag in hand. Meanwhile, more aircraft were approaching from multiple directions. I could see 6 Zeros and 4 Vals, all diving at once from different altitudes. It was a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm our defenses through sheer numbers. All guns, I called out. Multiple targets, all quadrants. The sky filled with tracers as every weapon on the ship opened fire simultaneously. The sound was indescribable, a continuous thunder that seemed to shake the very air. Black puffs of flak burst throughout the formation, and I watched 2 Zeros disintegrate under the barrage. But the others kept coming. A Val dive bomber was screaming down at us from 10,000 feet, its dive brakes deployed, the pilot aiming for our ammunition magazine. If he hit there, the explosion would vaporize the entire ship. "Dive bomber, 12 o'clock high," it shouted, tracking the target. "He's going for the magazine." Every gun that could elevate opened fire at once. The Val flew through a storm of steel and explosive shells, but the pilot never wavered. He was committed to his final attack, and nothing was going to stop him except death itself. The aircraft was 500 feet above us when gunner's mate First Class Bill Sanders made the shot of his life. His 5-inch shell caught the Val center mass, and the aircraft simply vaporized. One moment it was there, 1,000 pounds of metal and explosives and human determination. The next it was nothing but expanding gases and falling debris. "Direct hit," Sanders shouted. "Direct hit." But a Zero was coming in from the port quarter, flying so low its propeller was kicking up spray from the wave tops. This pilot was using the classic sea skimming approach, making himself almost invisible to our radar until the last second. "Zero," Port quarter on the deck, I called out, swinging the director to track the target. Range 500 and closing fast. The port side guns swiveled to meet the threat, but the Zero was already in its attack run. The pilot pulled up slightly, and I could see his face behind the windscreen, young, determined, already dead. Seaman First Class James Butler, manning the port 20mm gun, never flinched. He kept his weapon trained on the Zero, firing burst after burst even as the Japanese pilot's cannons sent shells walking across the deck around him. At the last second, Butler's tracers found their mark. The Zero's engine exploded in a sheet of flame, and the aircraft cartwheeled into the sea just 20 yards off our port bow. Got him, Butler shouted, his face blackened with powder burns, but grinning like a man who had just cheated death. But more were coming. Always more. A Kate bomber was approaching from the starboard beam, its torpedo clearly visible beneath the fuselage. This pilot was experienced. He had timed his approach perfectly, coming in during the chaos of the dive bombing attacks. Kate bomber, starboard beam, I called out. He's got a fish. The starboard guns engaged the Kate, sending a stream of tracers toward the aircraft. But the pilot was skilled. He jinked left and right, up and down, making himself a difficult target while maintaining his attack course. The Kate was 300 yards out when it dropped its torpedo. I watched the weapon hit the water and begin its run toward our engine room. At this range, there was no way to avoid it. Torpedo in the water, came the shout from the lookouts. Torpedo running hot, straight, and normal. All engines back emergency full, Captain Beckton ordered. Hard right rudder. The ship began to turn, but slowly, too slowly. The torpedo was closing fast, its wake visible in the water like a line of death. I could see the weapon running just beneath the surface, aimed directly at our vitals. Then, at the last second, something miraculous happened. The torpedo struck a piece of floating debris, part of a Zero's wing that had been drifting just beneath the surface. The explosion was tremendous, sending up a column of water that soaked everyone on deck, but it was 30 yards away from us instead of against our hull. Torpedo exploded prematurely, shouted the lookout. We're clear, but the Kate pilot wasn't finished. Having expended his weapon, he could have turned away and tried to escape. Instead, he pulled up in tow a climbing turn and came back at us, aiming his aircraft at our bridge like a manned missile. He's coming back, I shouted. All guns, all guns. Ramming attack. Every weapon on the ship that could bear open fire at once. The Kate flew through a storm of steel and explosive shells, but the pilot never wavered. He was committed to his final attack, and nothing was going to stop him except death itself. The aircraft was 20 yards away when Seaman First Class George Pullen, manning the forward 40mm gun, made another perfect shot. His burst caught the Kate in the cockpit, and the pilot slumped forward over the controls. The Kate veered to the right and crashed into the sea just off our starboard bow. The explosion was so close it cracked windows in the pilot house and sent debris flying across the deck, but we were still afloat. I looked at my watch. 1,500 hours. We had been under attack for 6 hours, and our ammunition was almost gone. My hands were shaking uncontrollably from exhaustion. My vision was blurred from staring through the rangefinder, and my throat was raw from shouting commands. Mickey, Tommy Chen called out, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not picking up any more formations. I think that might be it. I pressed my eye to the rangefinder and scanned the horizon. The sky was empty except for the smoke from burning aircraft and the distant contrails of our own combat air patrol. For the first time in 6 hours, no one was trying to kill us. All stations, Captain Beckton's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady despite everything we had been through. Ceasefire. Ceasefire. Secure from general quarters. The sudden silence was deafening. After 6 hours of continuous gunfire, the absence of sound was almost overwhelming. I could hear the waves lapping against our hull, the hiss of steam from damaged pipes, the quiet conversations of exhausted sailors. We had survived. Against all odds, through 6 hours of the most intense air attack in naval history, we had survived. The aftermath of battle is always the hardest part. When the guns fall silent and the smoke clears, that's when you see the true cost of victory. That's when you count the dead and tend the wounded and try to make sense of what you've just survived. I climbed down from the gun director on legs that felt like rubber. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the ladder rungs. 6 hours of continuous combat had left me drained, both physically and emotionally. The deck was a mess. Shell casings littered the superstructure like brass confetti, and the smell of cordite hung in the air like a chemical fog. Fragments from exploding aircraft had punched holes in everything: bulkheads, life rafts, even the ship's bell. But we were still afloat. Damaged, bloody, but still afloat. "Mickey," Tommy Chin called out, his voice hoarse from shouting target information. "You okay?" I turned to look at him. His face was blackened with powder burns. His uniform was torn and stained with blood that wasn't his own, and his eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much death in too short a time. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm okay. You?" "Still breathing," he said with a weak smile. "Still breathing." Captain Beckton's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady despite everything we had been through. "All department heads, report damage and casualties to the bridge. Corpsmen, lay to your stations. We have wounded men who need attention." I walked forward to check on the gun crews. The number 1 5-inch mount had taken a direct hit from a Kamikaze's 20mm cannon, but the crew was still at their stations, checking their equipment and preparing for another attack that might never come. Gunner's mate First Class Bill Sanders was sitting on an ammunition box, his head in his hands. He looked up as I approached, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "How many did we get, Mickey?" he asked. "How many of the bastards did we shoot down?" I thought about it for a moment. During the heat of battle, it was impossible to keep an accurate count. Aircraft were exploding all around us, sometimes from our fire, sometimes from the combat air patrol, sometimes from pure luck. "I don't know," I said honestly. "A lot. More than I could count." Sanders nodded slowly. "Good, that's good. They made us pay for it, but we made them pay more." I continued my rounds, checking on the other gun crews. The damage was extensive, but not fatal. We had holes in our hull, fires in 3 compartments, and our radar was operating at reduced capacity. But we were still afloat, still combat effective. The human cost was lighter than it could have been, but every casualty was a friend, a shipmate, a brother. Seaman First Class Harold Sampson was in sick bay with shrapnel wounds to his chest. Seaman First Class John Delevsky was unconscious from blood loss, but the corpsman said he would make it. In total, we had 11 wounded and, miraculously, no dead. It was a testament to American engineering, American training, and American courage that we had survived at all. "Mickey," called out Fire Controlman Second Class Danny Martinez from the aft director. "You need to see this." I walked back to his position and looked where he was pointing. In the distance, maybe 10 miles away, I could see columns of smoke rising from the horizon. Other ships had not been as fortunate as we were. "The Pringle got hit," Martinez said quietly. "Direct hit from a kamikaze. She broke in half and went down in 5 minutes. I felt a chill run down my spine. The USS Pringle was a destroyer just like us, with a crew of 300 good men. Now she was gone, resting on the bottom of the Pacific with most of her crew. "What about the others?" I asked. "The Hobson got hit too, but she's still afloat. The Bush took 2 kamikazes and had to be abandoned. The Coalhound didn't make it. The arithmetic of war is always cruel. For every ship that survived, another was lost. For every sailor who made it home, another was buried at sea. It was the price of victory, and we had paid it in blood. "Sir," called out Seaman First Class Robert Johnson from the portside 20-millimeter gun. "I've got something you need to see." I walked over to his position and looked where he was pointing. About 2 miles off our starboard bow, I could see a lone figure floating in the water. It was the Corsair pilot who had been shot down earlier in the battle. "He's still alive," Johnson said. "Been out there for 6 hours, but he's still alive." I grabbed a pair of binoculars and focused on the figure. The pilot was floating in his life jacket, one arm raised in a weak wave. He was exhausted, probably hypothermic, but still alive. "Signal the bridge," I ordered. "We've got a survivor in the water." Within minutes, Captain Becton had maneuvered the ship to pick up the downed pilot. As we pulled alongside, I could see his face, young, maybe 25, with the kind of mustache that made all the Navy pilots look like movie stars. "Welcome aboard," I said as we hauled him up onto the deck. "You picked a hell of a day to go swimming." The pilot looked up at me with exhausted eyes. "Thanks for the pickup," he said, his voice weak but steady. I was starting to think I was going to be feeding the fish. "What's your name, flyboy?" I asked. "Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell," he replied. "VF-15 off the Essex. I was flying combat air patrol when I got bounced by a Zero." I knew the name. McCampbell was already a legend in the fleet, the Navy's top ace with over 30 kills. He had been shot down while protecting us from the kamikaze attacks. "You did good work today, Commander," I said. "We saw you and your boys mixing it up with the Kamikaze. You probably saved our bacon." McCampbell smiled weakly. "That's what we're here for. How many did you boys get?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Lost count after the first hour. But we're still here, and they're not." The pilot nodded. "That's all that matters." "That's all that ever matters." As evening approached, I found myself back at the gun director, watching the sun set over the Pacific. The sky was painted in shades of red and gold, beautiful and peaceful as if the violence of the day had never happened. Tommy Chin joined me at the rail, his face still blackened with powder burns. "Think they'll be back tomorrow?" he asked. I shrugged. "Maybe. Probably. But we'll be ready for them." "How many more days like this can we take?" It was a good question. We had survived one of the most intense air attacks in naval history, but at what cost? Our ammunition was almost gone, our radar was damaged, and our crew was exhausted. Another attack like today's might finish us. "As many as it takes," I said finally. "As many as it takes." 78 years have passed since that April morning off Okinawa, and I still wake up sometimes to the sound of aircraft engines and the thunder of 5-inch guns. The nightmares have faded with time, but the memories remain as vivid as if they happened yesterday. We fought for 80 minutes that day, facing 22 separate kamikaze attacks. 22 young men who had written their own death sentences and were delivering them by hand. We shot down 18 of them, watched 4 more crash into the sea, and somehow survived to tell the tale. The USS Laffey limped back to port with 11 wounded sailors and more than 100 holes in her hull. The Navy wanted to scrap her, but Captain Becton fought to save his ship. She was repaired, refitted, and sent back into action just in time for the invasion of Japan, an invasion that never came, thanks to 2 atomic bombs and a Japanese surrender. The final accounting of that terrible day was sobering. The Japanese lost over 400 aircraft in their massive kamikaze assault on the American fleet. We lost 3 destroyers, 2 destroyer escorts, and dozens of smaller vessels. More than 500 American sailors died that day, and thousands more were wounded. But we held the line. We stood between the Kamikaze and the invasion fleet, and we held the line. The landing craft behind us continued their work, putting Marines and soldiers ashore on Okinawa. The war continued, and eventually it ended. I think about those Japanese pilots sometimes, young men not much different from ourselves. They died believing they were defending their homeland, just as we fought believing we were defending freedom. War makes enemies of men who might have been friends under different circumstances. But I also think about my shipmates, sailors like Tommy Chin and Bill Sanders and John Delevsky, men who stood their ground when hell came calling. They were ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things when their country needed them most. The Laffey survived the war and was eventually turned into a museum ship moored at Patriots Point in Charleston, South Carolina. Visitors can walk her decks and see the battle damage that was never fully repaired, holes in the superstructure, dents in the bulkheads, scars that tell the story of one terrible day when young Americans faced the divine wind and refused to yield. I visit her sometimes when my old bones can manage the trip. I stand on the deck where we fought for our lives and remember the men who stood with me. Most of them are gone now, killed in later battles, claimed by age and illness, or simply worn down by the weight of what we had seen and done. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The America they fought to defend has endured, imperfect but free, flawed but still striving to live up to its ideals. That's what we were fighting for that day off Okinawa, not just survival, but the idea that freedom is worth defending, no matter the cost. The kamikaze attacks on the American fleet were Japan's last desperate gamble, a final attempt to make the cost-off invasion so high that we would negotiate a peace that left their system intact. They failed, but not for lack of courage or determination. They failed because free men fighting for their homes and families will always find a way to prevail. That's the lesson of the Laffey and of all the ships that fought in the Pacific. When liberty is threatened, when democracy is under attack, when freedom itself hangs in the balance, ordinary Americans will rise to meet the challenge. They will stand their ground, they will fight with everything they have, and they will win. That's what we did that day off Okinawa. That's what Americans have always done, and God willing, that's what we'll always do. The divine wind blew hard that April morning, but it could not break the will of free men. It never has, and it never will. In memory of the crew of the USS Lafey DD 724 and all the sailors who stood against the kamikaze attacks off Okinawa. Their courage and sacrifice helped secure the victory that ended World War II and preserved freedom for generations to come.